Good morning. My name is Brendan McCluskey, and it's my privilege to welcome you all to the Neuqua Valley Veterans Ceremony.
And my name is Mylan Ross. It's our honor to be your host this morning. In addition to being proud Wildcats, we both have great respect and appreciation for those who have made the honorable choice to serve and defend our country.
I have the pleasure this morning to introduce Staff Sergeant Sean Austin from the United States Army for the posting of the colors, and Summer Moore, who will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please remain standing until you are asked to sit. Posting the colors today are 4 Neuqua Valley students who have earned the honorable distinction of Gold Award through the Girl Scouts or Eagle Scout through the Boy Scouts.
Color guard, attention. Forward, march. Color guard, halt. Post the colors.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Color guard, salute. 2. Color guard, retreat. Dismissed.
Please remain standing for the singing of the national anthem performed by Neuqua Valley senior Kinsey Alberts.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light, once so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the rampart we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
You may be seated.
Our theme for the Veterans Ceremony is family. Today, we'll hear from a number of people who are members of the Wildcat family and others who have direct ties to our Neuqua Valley family. We'll hear about one student's interest in serving her country. We'll see a video and learn more about Neuqua Valley substitute, Mr. Jim Wilson, and his service to our country. Dr. Fuhrer will share about the role our military plays with worldwide democracy. And you'll hear directly from our keynote speaker, Mr. Leo Pincala, who served in the Army before, during, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Finally, we'll enjoy some meaningful music from our men's ensemble while we honor, through photographs and music, NVH staff and families who have served. At this time, I'd like to welcome Neuqua Valley Senior Ella Lovaci to the podium to share about her interest to serve.
Good morning, and thank you all so much for being here today in honor of the men and women that have served and continue to serve our country. My name is Ella Lovaci, and I'm a senior here at Neuqua Valley. As I wrap up my college application process, I find myself going back in time and thinking about my ambitions as just an 8th grader. My history teacher at the time introduced me to the idea of service academies, and I was instantly hooked. After I had researched all 5 of them, I was certain that I wanted to attend the United States Air Force Academy. This ambition to pursue my college life at one of the service academies has catapulted me into my high school years, and here I am now, just about at the end of it. The desire to serve my country has not faded throughout the years, but it has continued to grow. Last year, I applied to the Air Force and Naval Academy summer seminar programs. For those of you that are unfamiliar with these programs, they're designed to give incoming senior students a taste of what life is like at the service academies. Fortunately enough, I had the opportunity to attend the summer seminar program at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. So in June, I flew out to Maryland and spent a week living the life of a plebe, which is what they call the freshman at the Naval Academy. I started every morning with a 5:30 a.m. wake up, and it was not a nice way to wake up, where you have a little alarm that goes off, and then you just get out of bed at your own leisure. No, it was actually quite the opposite. You have your squad leaders that run up and down the hallways, and they're playing sirens and loud music and yelling at you to wake up. So then once you do finally force yourself to jump out of bed, the bed then has to be perfectly made, and then you have 2 minutes to run down the hall, brush your teeth, and do what you need to do, and then right into formation for PT. Then you have an hour and a half of intense physical training, and then it's straight back to the dorms to get ready for breakfast. Exactly how every 17-year-old wants to start each of their mornings for the next 4 years of their life, right? Well, for me, that's exactly the case. There was something so exciting and intriguing about the whole experience that by the end of the week, it felt so natural to me. During my time at the Naval Academy, not only did I experience the demanding schedule that constantly had me moving, and the pain in my muscles from the 100 push-ups that we did each day, and the overall intensity that just accompanies being a member of the military, but I was able to experience a sense of family and community that is so beyond prevalent within the military. The way they teach you to care for one another and to be accountable for not only your success, but the success of each and every one of your teammates is something that I found so important, because you truly are not able to find that everywhere. And I want to be part of a society that values the well-being of everyone. I want to be part of a community that puts service before self, and I want to be part of an institution that instills integrity, honor, and duty into each and every one of its students. Transitioning back to my 8th grade self and looking into the future at where I am today, I never would have thought that I would have the experience to experience what life is like in the military as a high school student. However, I can say that without a doubt in my mind, I'm beyond thankful for that opportunity, because now I know that this is truly what I want to do with my future, and that I'm ready for a life of service and dedication to my country. Although I'm unsure of where I will end up for college next year, I do know that wherever I end up going, I will continue to pursue a life of dedication and service in the military. Thank you, and happy Veterans Day.
Let's give one more round of applause for Ella. As we mentioned, today's program is all about family. Every student and staff member is a part of the Neuqua Valley family, and this includes our valued substitutes who step in for our teachers when they're missing. We'd like to take a few moments to share the story of one of our valued substitutes who has served our country.
How many of you have been in class with me before?
There is no doubt that many of you know one of our treasured substitute teachers, Mr. Jim Wilson. Mr. Wilson has been subbing at Neuqua Valley since 2003 in just about every subject area. But what you may not know is that Mr. Wilson is a veteran of our armed forces.
I was in the United States Air Force from 1956 to 1960, and I was a corporal when I finished. I always wanted to be in the military since I was a little kid. Growing up on my dad's farm, we were near Peterson Air Base, and during the war there were B-25s and P-38s flying around all the time. And then Fort Carson was just across the creek from Dad's farm, so the military was there and I was aware of it, and I always wanted to be part of it. I was what the Air Force called an air policeman. That's the Air Force version of a military policeman. And I did a little bit of law enforcement, but mostly I was involved with securing the airplanes and the missiles security work.
Mr. Wilson only spent a year in college before a high school friend of his, Jerry Lacey, said, "Let's go join the Air Force." And they did. He went to basic training at Parks Air Force Base in California, and then was sent to George Air Force Base, also in California. He was there for a little over a year and received, as he put it, on-the-job training before being sent overseas.
I went to Molesworth, England. There were a bunch of us, maybe 20 of us, all of a sudden just got picked up and sent to England because there was a storage area there that had some highly secret stuff in it that needed some security, and that's what we were there for.
After spending time in England, Mr. Wilson and other members of his company were sent to Eton Air Base in France, where he was stationed for approximately a year. His role was to protect the nuclear weapons stored at this base. In October of 1959, Mr. Wilson received a notice that he was to report to the Air Force Base in Bitburg, Germany. His role there was still in security.
We had Matador missiles, and these were, I guess, maybe well described as a cruise missile. They were subsonic, but they flew like a small jet, and they were radio controlled. But the missiles launch sites were out in the woods in a national forest in the Eifel Mountains, and the Germans are very protective of their trees, so they would allow an area to be cleared big enough for a launch pad, but no permanent fencing, and you couldn't clear back from the fence. The bushes go right up to the fence, which makes it a security nightmare because you can't see somebody coming, particularly at night. So that's what we're doing. We were making sure that nobody tampered with the missiles, because we always said that we could launch in 6 minutes.
Mr. Wilson served during the height of the Cold War, and while he never saw actual combat, the threat of a nuclear war was one thing that was always at the forefront of their minds.
When I was in Europe, Khrushchev told Eisenhower to get his people out of Berlin, and I, of course, told him to pound sand. But if there's always something going on, we were on alert a lot. And everybody thought the world was going to end in a mushroom cloud in those days. Everybody, I would think 80% of the people assumed that we would at some point go to war with the Soviet Union. So that was kind of expected.
Mr. Wilson left the Air Force in May of 1960, when his tour was done, and went back to college at Colorado State University. There he majored in business administration and graduated in 1963. He took a job working in the oil fields in Flora, Illinois. Years later, why does an oil field engineer make the transition to being a substitute teacher?
if I had to leave 3M before I was ready to stop working, that sub-teaching might be a good way to have something to do and also make a contribution.
In 2003, Mr. Wilson submitted the paperwork to become a substitute teacher and took on jobs at Hinsdale South and Westmont before receiving a call from District 204.
Jody Plowman used to be the sub-caller for Neuqua. And she called one day when I was not there and asked my wife if I would mind subbing at Indian Plains. Of course. And then she did explain, now this is alternative school, it might be a tough subbing job. My wife said, that's fine, he wouldn't mind. So I ended up at IP. And I was a little worried about that, but I got there and the first day went well, and then they wanted me back for, it got to be several days in a row. And then I came to Neuqua, and I went to some of the middle schools and even an elementary school or two, but finally it became obvious to me that Neuqua was really the place to be. Got to where I was coming here almost every day, and it's worked out that way. Being with the kids is a good thing. I enjoy being here with the kids and talking to them and realizing that people who say that our next generation is not going to be any good are mistaken. Because these are great kids. And the only thing is you have to be willing to be the dumbest person in the room once in a while. You get in some of these good classes. I mean, we're talking smart people and dedicated and workers, and you're just proud to be part of the operation.
We are very fortunate Mr. Wilson chose to serve his community by being a substitute teacher here at Neuqua Valley, but we are forever grateful for his time in our armed forces. When asked what it meant to serve his country, Mr. Wilson summed it up in just a few short words.
People these days will thank you for your service, and that's nice. And I always thank them for thanking me, and I say, I gained more than I gave.
Mr. Jim Wilson, could you please stand, give us a chance to give you the applause you deserve? Like so many others, you answered many calls for service, whether it be our classrooms or on other continents, and we stand here today giving you our gratitude. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lance Fuhrer, and on behalf of our students and staff, we welcome you to what we hope is an opportunity to reflect, to remember the veterans in your lives, and to recognize ones that you might learn about for the first time today. Before I begin, there are two groups that I'd like to recognize. One is our district leadership, and the other is some active members of our military today. First, we have several board members that are here, and I'd ask them to stand once I read their name. Lori Donahue, Natasha Grover, and Justin Karubis are here representing our Board of Education. Along with our board president, Mike Razak. And from our district leadership, Dr. Lewis Lee, who is our assistant superintendent for the high schools. We also have three members, active members of our military here with us today. From the United States Army, Staff Sergeant Sean Austin and Staff Sergeant Justin DeVos. And from the United States Navy, Petty Officer Bill Virgil. On behalf of our students and staff, we thank you for your service, your strength, and the sacrifices you've made so that all of us have the privilege of being in a place like this. Nearly a year before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt used his State of the Union address in January of 1941 to outline what he called 4 freedoms essential to the preservation of democracy. Those 4 freedoms were these: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, or economic freedom, and freedom from fear. As he spoke, the war was already raging across the continent, and in less than a year, December 7th, 1941, that war would come to us. Over the next half century, these freedoms were defended in many places, from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, from missile bases in a small place called Cuba, all the way over to a concrete wall that divided the city of Berlin. The Berlin Wall became a symbol of the division between nations and peoples who embraced those 4 freedoms and those that did not. In 1989, 30 years ago today, that wall came down. But what remained standing were those 4 freedoms. This morning, we have a great privilege to hear from someone who was there before, during, and after that wall in that divided and then reunited city of Berlin. To introduce him, I'd like to welcome a member of our Neuqua Valley faculty, Len Pencala, who will join us at the podium.
I had all sorts of really nice things to say about my nephew, Leo, and I was going to really try to impress you with all these things, but I took a peek at his speech, and everything nice that could be said about him is already in his speech. So with that being said, I will introduce with a small anecdote. My father's name was Leo. My brother, his dad's name is Leo, and his name is Leo. And so when he was born, we had to come up with a way to discern who's who we're talking about. So we called him Little Leo, because he was the littlest of them all. So we moved that forward about 25 years, and we were at a nice little meeting with heads of nursing about the nursing for my sister who was in a convalescent center. And everybody was there except for perhaps my brother, and I was talking to Junior here, and they said, could we start the meeting? I said, no, we have to wait for Leo. And they said, well, I thought this was Leo. I said, no, that's Little Leo. And they said, well, if that's Little Leo, we don't really want to wait for Big Leo. So with that, I'm very proud for how many of my family have served us in conflict and in foreign nations, and none more so than my nephew, Leo W. Pencala.
Hello. Couple things first. Thank you for your service. Without our members of the armed forces, we would not have the freedoms we all enjoy today. I promise you that. Okay? I've witnessed it firsthand. Who here is already committed? So sorry. The Dago in me is coming out. Who in here is already signed up and committed to go in the service? Anybody? Nobody yet? I don't see any hands. Who's thinking about going in the service? What branch? Marines. Of course, the Marines. You have a second option? The Marines, hoorah. Everybody wants to be in the Marines. The Marines are great people. They're hard to get into, and you'll need crayons, okay? When you join the Marines, you'll know what that means. Anybody want the Army? Air Force, hoorah. Very hard to get into, but it's a great organization. They do it right. They send their officers into the war and let their other people sit back. And great chow halls. That's important. Okay. While I was sitting here and they were doing a posting of the colors, everybody was quiet. You're watching the flags come down. Up until it was time to stand, everybody thought that was a fun time to talk and chatter with your friend next door, maybe elbow, play a little grab butt or something. There should have been no talking during that period, okay? Because for a service person, somebody who served, that flag means a lot. We put our lives on the line for that flag. Some of our friends have died for that flag. They were buried with that flag on their coffin. And so when you see that flag come past you, whether it's at a ceremony like today, whether it's in a parade, stand, respect it, If you're talking, stop talking. If you're texting, stop texting. It will be there to wait when that flag comes past you. You take your hat off, you respect it, because somebody that day was most likely buried with that flag on top of them for the service that they gave to this country for us to have our freedoms. And it's kind of ironic, as that flag was being posted, my phone starts texting. I get a vibration. So I wait until it comes past, and it's a phone call from a gentleman named Howard Chittenden. Don't look up his name now, I'd rather you look at me, little Leo here, okay? But when you leave, look him up. Howard Chittenden just celebrated his 99th birthday. He was a China Marine, stationed in China as a Marine. On the first day we entered World War II, he was captured as a POW from Japan. He spent the rest of World War II as a POW, the entire World War II. He's a dear friend of mine, and I hear from him quite often, and I eat lunch with him, and he's going to be celebrating his 100th birthday next May. And so, as this flag is being posted, and we hear about World War II and Berlin today, think of people like Howard, who spent it as a POW as well, or who didn't make it home. My wife's grandfather was first wave D-Day, and he survived. Not many survived to tell the story about first wave of D-Day, okay? He was on Normandy. So, think of that flag and all those people who died for it, and try to respect it. Before today, or before this ceremony, did anybody really ever hear of Berlin? The Berlin Wall? A little bit? Not much, not a lot of hands. You're not alone. I find as I talk about it and travel and speak to people, fewer and fewer people have heard about it or even know the significance of it. And so I'm glad to be here. When Uncle Lenny contacted me, he sent me an email saying, hey, would you be interested in being interviewed? The school wants to just see if anybody was stationed in Berlin, lived in Berlin, East or West Berlin, and East or West Germany at the time of the Berlin Wall. So he said, hey, would you be interested in being interviewed? Sure, I figured I'd get to be interviewed, have my picture up here on the big screen, and I'd be done with it. A couple days later, I get a call from Miss Trout. She asked me some questions about my service. A couple days later, I get another call from Miss Trout and Mr. Perry, I believe his name is, and next thing you know, at the end of that conversation, hey, would you like to be a keynote speaker at the ceremony? Sure, why not? That's got to be better than being on the big screen, right? So that brings me here. This rock right here brings me to you today. Seems really insignificant. I've walked around with this rock before and put it on people's tables. This piece of rebar, all of about 5 inches long, right here. This is what we're here to see today. So as you know, my name is Leo. I'll give you a little background. I'm the commander of the DuPage Memorial Veterans of Foreign Wars. Reason for the nice hat. I'm not the good humor man. In the VFW, we have hats and we're all about ceremonies and traditions. In the military, we wear caps. And so in the VFW, we wear a cap. I'm also a retired 28-year deputy with the DuPage County Sheriff's Office, and also a former United States infantry soldier, and I was stationed in Berlin, Germany. So, if you can't, hopefully I'm not going to drop an F-bomb, because with my background, you just never know what's going to happen, so I hope somebody up there has a button to stop it from getting aired on YouTube. Okay. YouTube is what my granddaughter calls it, so I keep going with it. While this looks like an ordinary run-of-the-mill piece of concrete, this piece actually signifies something much larger. This piece of concrete represents approximately 97 miles of concrete that divided the city in half. At some points, the wall stood 13 feet tall, 8 feet wide, and people died trying to cross it. It wasn't just there to keep, bad guys in or out. People were dying to get to the other side. It signifies the heartache families endured for generations, political differences, the threat of war, and so much more. It also signifies the era known as the Cold War. I was stationed in Berlin, Germany as an infantry soldier. I was there before, during, and after the wall fell. I personally broke this piece of the Berlin Wall off at Brandenburg Gate. Brandenburg Gate was and still is now, again, a main passage between East and West Berlin, but at the time it was closed off by a wall. So while preparing for this speech, I was trying to decide how to describe Berlin, the Berlin Wall, because obviously you guys weren't around for it. Chances are many of your parents were, but they don't know much about it, okay, because it really wasn't taught. So I'm going to try to explain it to you where you can understand. Berlin is a city which sits 110 miles inside what was formerly known as East Germany. East Germany at the time was a communist state. At the end of World War II, armed forces, along with the British and the French and the American, entered Berlin and occupied what was referred to as West Berlin. The Russian forces occupied East Berlin. It was not until 1961 that the city became divided by a physical barrier. There were many reasons as to why the Russians and East German government built the wall, but the main reason was to keep the people of the East from fleeing to the West. They didn't want our ways to corrupt them, is what they say, but it was to keep them in. So a barrier literally was erected overnight. People went to sleep with their families, and then the next day there was a barrier dividing them that they could no longer cross. It was at first a barbed wire fence, and within days a concrete wall dividing West Berlin from East Berlin and completely around West Berlin, separating it from the rest of East Germany. So the people in West Berlin lived inside a complete concrete wall. I know it sounds a little confusing because here you have a city 110 miles in communist territory, and half of it was free and the other half was controlled by the Russians. So it's a little confusing. So, sir right here in the white shirt, right in front of me, sir. Yeah, the one talking. Yeah. Can you stand for 1 second, please? Right here, East Berlin. You can sit down. I just want to show you right here, West Berlin. There's a wall right down the center. So these were your neighbors, your friends, your family, everything right here. And overnight, you could no longer reach to them. This side is controlled by the Russians. This side, you have the Allied forces, French and American and British, protecting you. We had sectors dividing us. The French, the British, and American all had sectors. There was no wall or barrier dividing the sectors. It was just the Allied forces broke the city into thirds so that we could protect the city. There would be signs that said you are now leaving the American sector, the British sector, you're entering the American sector, or where have it throughout that sector. But there was no physical barrier. West Berlin had a wall completely around you, so you lived inside a concrete wall. Lost my place here. So you now can kind of get a picture that your school here, figure that as East Germany. If you're trying to figure out how big this is, your school is East Germany, and this is Berlin right here, this little section, okay? So, after all, we were at 110 miles in communist territory. So we're there to protect the city, but in actuality, we were just an alarm. Because if the Russians wanted to take over the city, they were, because we were already in communist territory. So we were there in case if World War III was going to happen, it was happening in Berlin. It was going to start there, the Russians would come in and take the city, and then they would go from there and invade. So we were just the warning signals for NATO to know, hey, the Russians are coming, prepare. We like to tell ourselves we were there to kick butt. We trained, we did what we did, but in actuality, we probably were going to be captured pretty quick. Berlin was often used as a political propaganda tool between Russia and the United States. Politicians would often come into Berlin for photo ops on the wall and to gain press coverage. President Ronald Reagan visited Berlin and stood at Brandenburg Gate and stated to the Russian president, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Some of you may have even seen that speech recently on the news. My son sent it to me, and he was in Missouri just yesterday, and a portion of it was aired on their news. President John F. Kennedy traveled to Berlin in his effort to show solidarity to the citizens of Berlin, stated, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which means I am a Berliner. Some people back then tried to say it meant I was a donut, because Berliner was also called a donut, but it meant I am a Berliner. While politicians and other dignitaries used the wall as a political propaganda tool, the soldiers of Berlin patrolled the wall 24/7. The patrols were either done on foot or in a vehicle of some form. It was not uncommon to be on patrol duty and observe the Russian soldiers pointing their weapons at us. I personally was sitting at the wall on Brandenburg Gate, laying in the prone position with my weapon pointed at a Russian soldier with his weapon pointed at me, knowing that any time something could happen. And the only thing between us was probably from here to where the control room is. We could see each other down the barrel of our weapon. Remember, this was the height of the Cold War. Tensions were high and the relationship with Russia were volatile. And we had Russian soldiers pointing weapons at us. So you can imagine the tension that we lived with every day within that city. As these photos behind me scroll, you will see some photos of the wall. On one side of the wall, the west side, people, you would see it full of graffiti, paintings, signatures. People would leave messages of their loved ones on there. People would often gather there around the wall, specifically around Brandenburg Gate was a popular place for tourists and people in the city who live there to visit. On the east side, you will see the wall is completely bright white. There is a large area before the wall that is also open. This area is lit up with bright lights. You can see the bright wall. This picture was taken by me looking through a crack in the Berlin Wall. And this is East Germany, East Berlin. There's that white wall you'll see over there is what you would see on the east side. It was lit up at night. There was a big area that was open. It had landmines, tank mines, barriers, dogs patrolling it, soldiers patrolling it. It was known as the Death Strip. The reason it was bright white was it would reflect your shadow. So if you walked, which was against the law for the East Germans, the East Berlin, to walk on the same side of the street as the wall. If you walked on the side of the wall and it reflected your shadow, they had something to shoot at. Think about that for a minute. They were going to shoot at the shadows because it was on that wall. So we're pretty lucky to be living in a free country. Residents of East Berlin were not allowed to walk on the same side of that street on the wall. I personally was able to go over there one time, and I saw bullet holes in the wall. I also saw the bunker where Hitler committed suicide. So it was quite an experience for me, being a young soldier, travel to the east side and experience it. And unless you've experienced what I'm about to say next, you're probably going to look at me like I'm crazy. But I was in West Berlin. It was a sunny day. It was beautiful. Sun was shining, and it was just a glorious day. As soon as I crossed into East Berlin on the bus, it became dreary. There was no color. There was no life. It was depressing as soon as I crossed in. It was like the sun did not shine on that side of the wall. And only somebody who has experienced it can acknowledge that they felt the same thing. So, as I previously stated, Berlin was a propaganda tool not just for the Allied forces, but the Russians as well. They wanted to show how great things were on their side of the wall. They wanted to show that things weren't as bad as people say. In West Berlin, at Brandenburg Gate, the Russians had a military memorial, much like our memorial at the Arlington Cemetery. At this memorial, soldiers will perform guard duty. At their memorial, they would also do changing of guard ritual with the high step, goose steps. Very similar to how we do changing of the guard at the Arlington Cemetery for a Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So yes, this was done inside West Berlin. So we now had Russian soldiers that traveled into West Berlin every day for their memorial. That was done 24/7, 365 days. There were checkpoints between West and Berlin where people could travel. Many people from the west would go to the east. While it was possible for citizens of the east to travel to West Berlin, it was highly unlikely. While there were several checkpoints throughout the wall, the most famous was Checkpoint Charlie. My life as an infantry soldier in Berlin was exciting, as well as you can imagine, very scary at times. I was 18 years old when I first stepped foot in Berlin. I flew from Chicago to Berlin on commercial airlines. Upon my arrival in Berlin, I immediately knew I was in for a new experience in my life, as there were soldiers walking around the airport with automatic Uzis. So I knew I wasn't in Kansas anymore. As we traveled from the airport in Berlin to McNair Barracks, which was home to the 4th, 5th, and 6th of the 502nd Infantry, I will never forget the sight of a Russian tank patrolling the border of the Berlin Wall. At that point, I knew I was in for something. I just didn't know what, and my life wasn't going to be the same. During my time in Berlin, I was fortunate. After a few months of arriving in Berlin, my wife and my daughter were able to join me. We lived on what we referred to as the economy. This is slang for living in general housing out on the streets and not in barracks somewhere. But there were conditions that were put on us for living out in the economy. One of those conditions was if I received a phone call from the command, I was required to be at the barracks and ready to roll within a certain amount of time. Since our phone calls were always at risk of being monitored and taped by the Russians, everything was done in code. I'd call home. My dad or my family would always say, "Hi, Charlie, how you doing?" to Russia on the other side of the phone because we knew we were being recorded. We had codes in our command. It would be something simple: orange, blue, one word, and it changed frequently. You'd get the call at 2 a.m., orange, Each code signified a certain amount of time that you had to get to your barracks so that you could ready to roll for whatever mission we were going on. It could be you had to get here now, or you could just leisurely stroll in and maybe get there within an hour, hour and a half. It was not uncommon to get a call at 2 a.m., be given a code, we come in, and I would kiss my wife and my daughter goodbye because I didn't know if I was coming home that night or I was going to be gone for several days on a mission somewhere in training. We didn't know because we weren't told until we got there. While I have many special events I'll never forget, there is one date I hope to never forget. The date is very special to me. Sometimes you don't realize how special it is until I'm typing this and I find myself getting emotional about something that happened 30 years ago. A date where I was able to be part of history. Not many can say that. In the history of the Berlin Brigade, I believe there was somewhere around 100,000 soldiers that served over there. It's not a large group. We were referred to as the unique. We were in a unique position, unique training. Everything was unique about us. Everything from doing parades for dignitaries, Russian dignitaries, American dignitaries, French dignitaries, to showing off all of our weapons that we had. A date that's very special to me, and a date in history, is a date where we witnessed the end of communism as we knew it. A date that in time ended the threat of World War III, and it ended the Cold War. The date is November 9th, 1989, the day the Berlin Wall fell. But on this date, when we got the call to immediately return to our command, we did not know what was going on. We were not given advance notice that the Russians had planned to open up the wall and were allowing people to travel. We were put on the highest alert, because after all, was this the Russians invading the city? Was this a ploy for them to get through? Were they sneaking soldiers in? What was coming after they were releasing swarms of civilians into the city? We had no idea. And so everybody, all units, all infantry, all MPs, everybody were put into positions until everything could be figured out. It took a day or two before we realized that the Berlin Wall had actually fell and history just happened. At that time, we celebrated the event with the East and West Berliners as if we were their family. The soldiers that we pointed our weapons at and they pointed at us was no longer the threat that they were before. We were shaking their hands, talking to them, trading trinkets, military memorabilia, and it was almost as if we were friends. You'll see a picture. In one of them, you may have saw soldiers on top of the wall. That was the Russian soldiers. There was no weapons in their hand at that time. They were all clumped together. That's because at the time, there was no longer the threat of the Cold War. After 10,316 days, a barrier that divided a city had fallen, and families were reunited. It was a very special moment to witness such an event. Even though the Russian government stated they were allowing unrestricted travel, for some reason the citizens of East Berlin didn't really believe them much. Go figure. So it took a while before they realized that they could travel, but a lot of them had now left their homes with nothing. No food, no money, no place to live, and no job. And now they're living on the streets of Berlin. It put a taxing on the system in Berlin. It wasn't for a while before they realized they could then travel back to their homes and travel freely between the two parts of the city, east and west. Today, 30 years later, Berlin is united. Brandenburg Gate is no longer blocked off with a wall. It is again a main passage between the once divided city. Pieces of the wall remain on the border only as a reminder of what didn't work. And to remind people, barriers aren't always the answer to a much larger problem. Please don't let the city of Berlin and the Berlin Wall be forgotten. It's a part of history that deserves to be and needs to be remembered. If we don't remember our history, we're going to repeat it, and it may not always work out better. Okay? So just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. If you enjoy your freedoms, thank a service member or a veteran, because they are the reasons that we have them. If you can read your text messages and count the money in your pocket, thank a teacher, because they're the reasons you can do that. I could sit here and talk about Berlin all day, but I was only given about 15 minutes, and I think I surpassed that. So I would like to thank you for your time, and I would ask that as you guys have nothing else to do on your weekend, maybe you can do a little research on the Berlin Wall and educate yourself. And also think of Howard Chittenden and read his story, because it's quite amazing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Binkala, for sharing your story with us. At this time, I would like to introduce our men's ensemble, made up of both bass chorus and varsity singers. They will be singing "Who Are the Brave?" The text of this selection repeatedly asks this question: who are the brave? Bravery takes many forms and is championed by many different sorts of people. By those in pain, by those whose lives are plain, by those who go to war, and by those who fight no more. Though we rightfully gather today to honor and thank those who serve and have served in the military, the men of Neuqua's choir reveal through this song that the opportunity for bravery might extend to all of us. All the pictures in the slideshow represent mothers, daughters, fathers, grandfathers, sons, and alumni, and relatives of our Neuqua Valley staff. We treasure their service to our country and are pleased to have the opportunity to honor them today.
These words have been used often, but carry much weight. The price of freedom is high. We can't forget those that are willing to pay for it. Today, we celebrate Americans' veterans for keeping this nation the land of the free and the home of the brave. When you see a veteran today, take time to thank him or her for serving our country. And thank all of you for being here today. Would you please rise as we return the colors?
Color guard, attention. Forward, march. Color guard, halt. Retrieve the colors. Forward, march. Color guard, halt. Dismissed.
You got a chance today to meet two people that before you did not know. You might have heard their name, you might have seen Mr. Wilson in a classroom that you were in, but now you know something very important. You know their stories. And when we started today, we gave you a challenge to reflect, remember, and recognize. I hope you can reflect on what their stories mean and you can find a place in your life for how it made it possible, how it made it different. I hope you remember the things that they shared about their own personal experience, everything from missiles in England to a wall in Germany to what you should think about when you see colors posted and you see our flag. And that today you take seriously the challenge that we give you to recognize someone in your life that the military has touched and has changed. You saw in our slides how many faculty, how many teachers have had uncles and husbands and cousins and children and wives that have served this country and helped make it what it is. Before being dismissed, I want to thank our Neuqua Valley Media Department for their work today, not only on the production that you were able to see and enjoy, but capturing this and live streaming it. Our Neuqua Valley Music Department for an incredible gift of music that they always provide. David Perry and Linda Jacoby for making this ceremony every year unforgettable. And thank you to you for being a part of it. You are dismissed to 7th hour.